Hello and welcome to PSY 6810, Capstone for Educational Psychology. I'm Dr. Joel B. Goodin, and I'll be talking about Week 7 assignment, create a representation of your research. I'm going to switch to Word format here where I have just pasted everything from the course information to a Word document so that I can play with it a little bit easier and hopefully explain it. I'm going to blow this up a little bit. Alright, it has two parts, right? So be sure to read each part carefully before completion, and that's another good reminder to always go back and say, did I do everything that it asked? Before you submit it, go back, double check, triple check. Have I done everything? If you didn't do something, there's a good sign. You're going to get 0 credit for that missing piece. So I don't have a lot more to say about that. That's something I talk about every week. Part 1, you're asked to design a comprehensive presentation outline. So for this component, create a comprehensive means including everything. It needs to be well thought out. An outline that you will use to develop next week's assignment, your final capstone research paper and presentation. Okay, so what do you need to get from this? You need to hear the words okay, it should be very thorough. It should give me a very good idea of what you're doing so that I can give you some feedback and say you're in the right direction, you're headed in the right direction, or you're headed in the wrong direction, or maybe you're missing this piece, or maybe, you know, just anything. And part of this process, it needs to be understood, as was said earlier in this course and every course, we always point to the signature assignment and say, hey, start working on that now, because if you wait, it's going to be a very substantive project, so to speak, during that week, and you're probably not going to be as successful if you try to do it all at once without sort of building the foundation as you go. So provide enough detail that a reader may discern the overall ideas your final deliverables will address. Okay, so tons of detail, spelled correctly, hopefully. So needs to be obvious what your final deliverable will be about. The topic. It may also help to review the required components of the capstone research paper that is due next week. Go ahead and flip over to week 8 and take a look at it a little more closely. Why not? That's what you're building this outline for. So look at it, use it. The main components, including the introduction, problem statement, purpose statement, research findings, and conclusions. So you should have all these. There is not a situation in which you will not include these components because they are required pieces of the assignment. You will have, since it's built off of research, you're going to talk about the introduction to the research, the research problem statement, the purpose statement, as in the purpose of the research, the findings, and the conclusions that you can make from those findings. So use the following questions as a guide to complete your outline. General theme and sub-themes. What knowledge and skill areas will be the focus of your training or webinar? So what are some learning objectives that you might have, or knowledge outcomes that might even be measurable? Not that you're planning to measure them, but what would you hope that they must know this, they need to, and even use some Maslow sort of wording. They should be able to define something, or to apply knowledge. What would they be able to do, and sort of diversify how they could show their knowledge and understanding of whatever it is you're trying to teach them. If you don't evaluate your training, how do you know it's working, is generally the idea there. So goals and objectives. What do you want participants to learn during the training or webinar? What will they leave knowing more about, or what new skills will they have acquired? So some of these may overlap a good bit. This one, I think, essentially says what I just spoke about under the themes and sub-themes category. So maybe up here, say what themes, sub-themes should the audience member understand? What central questions should participants answer as the training or webinar unfolds? So what are they? What are essential questions? What central questions should participants answer as the training or webinar unfolds? So here we're looking at central questions as in primary. So what are the primary questions that you might say to participants? Think about what you would do in situation X. How would you react? And maybe that's a central question that you want them to sort of be pondering as they go through your training. A summary of their activities. So this is something in a training. We need to know what the training will involve in terms of application and practice. What are the participants actually going to be doing? And this is more in a training than if it's a webinar. You can be a little light on this. How will participants accomplish training objectives and answer the questions in numbers 2 and 3 above? I believe that's goals and objectives and the essential questions. How will they accomplish? So typically, if you're like teaching K-12, we often use the SWABAT method. In this case, we're not really talking about students, but we'll use that. Students will be able to do X. But this is more of how. Um, so this is less than what they're going to be able to do, but what they'll actually do during the training. So let's focus on, so maybe SWABAT, I should probably move this, maybe up here. And during training, so student, or not students, but participants or audience members will interact in a group focus session or a bridge building exercise or whatever it is, and explain how that, what the training includes, what behaviors you will see from the trainees, and then what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, resources. What resources might the trainer use to help participants accomplish the training or webinar objectives? Is there something they need to be prepared with or have handy? And these may be things. Your training needs to be motivational. So notice that it says encouragement. And that could be even sort of scaffolding their process by sort of giving them some materials to outline what they'll be doing, fill in the blank sort of thing, or reflective paperwork where they can sort of think about, you can sort of take pauses within the training or webinar and say, now reflect on question 5, and have them fill that in, and or whatever you're training, it's going to vary. So what do they need? Do they need research? Articles that you need to provide to them, something like that they probably need to be, you need to be familiar with this article before we really move on. Discussion platform, and maybe, you know, having had a discussion already or during the training. And then resources can be much more tangible. They can be, do they need a whiteboard? Do they need paper? Do they need crayons? Dry erase markers? What is it? Do they need, you know, materials? Do they need to know that their bosses, say these are K-12 teachers, do they need to know that their principals and superintendents are expecting them to implement this? Do they need that encouragement from their principals and superintendents, and not have this be something, well, you're gonna have to use your own time, you're gonna have to where it's not as encouraged. So what resources do you really need to have in place? And that can just be the support of the principal, superintendent, school system, for instance. Just depends on your audience. Assessment activities. How will others determine if your participants have reached your objectives identified in number 2 above and can answer the questions in number 3 above? So reflect and then decide on how objectives could be measured. have a plan in place. So you need to actually have a plan for something, maybe a sort of not a quiz that maybe applies a lot of pressure, but say, hey, we're looking for feedback, we're looking to sort of gauge how well this training is working, we're hoping to improve the training always, so we want to see if you've captured the material as we've tried to present it, and so will you please, take a few minutes to try to answer these questions so that they were the goals of the training. So you might say that without applying a whole lot of pressure, and then say, well, in order to meet objective 1, to apply knowledge of A, trainees will be asked to read an excerpt, I'm just making up an example, and apply their knowledge of A to responding to the excerpt. And then answer the questions in number 3 above. Number 3 were the essential questions. So how would you react? So an example there, they need to actually respond to that after, maybe probably at the end of the training, say, well, as of the end of training, trainees will be asked to explain how they would react to situation Y, given a choice of 5 resources. So sort of set up a situation in which they're asked to actually answer that question that you've posed up there. And so the idea here is that every training needs to be well developed and organized and planned so that you have sort of a feedback loop. Later in the training, or when the training is over, you can ask them questions that you have prepared them for. And there really shouldn't be really a distance there, or an impasse. It should be pretty obvious for them to connect. Oh, well, you've been training us to do this, you've been talking about this, you've been hitting that note over and over again, and now you want me to apply that knowledge or answer that question that you've been talking about. During the training, I want you to think about this question. How will you react to whatever? And then at the end, of course, they're not going to be surprised when you say, so now it's time. Tell me, explain in words or pictures or however you want them to respond. Have them actually respond to that question. Part 1, length, we're looking for 2 to 3 pages. And so you want to be concise, but thorough, which means you really need to avoid and so you can't go into too much detail with like what the training will do. First, people will walk into the room, then people will sit down, but you want to cover the main goals. If you go over 3 pages, it could be just your formatting of how you're writing. And so you'll want to potentially, you might go over the 3 pages. You don't want to go to 6, 7, 8 pages or any higher than that, because that probably shows that you're including a lot of extraneous information. You do want to include a minimum of 3 scholarly sources. So um, you might mention in terms of resources, well, it's good to have, they need to feel um, supported by their uh, superintendent or administrators, and you could cite a source to support that. You could explain a few of some of the logic of why you're doing things the way you're doing, why you're asking the questions you're asking, and support that with scholarly citation from current peer-reviewed articles. Be good. So then you're asked to employ presentation material development. The presentation objectives are now finalized for each content area. Instructional strategies are developed for each performance objective, and participant materials and certain aids are developed to guide participants to successfully meet the outcomes of the training. So break this down. This is really just a note. This is where we should be. Objectives are finalized. Instructional strategies developed, and they're designed to target each performance objective. Materials and aids are developed, and we're trying to meet those expected outcomes. So essentially we're asking something like, does everything align? Was the training was it developed clearly to meet the objectives? If not, you might need to modify your training to more clearly. It's almost like the idea that is kind of unpopular in some of the high stakes testing, but teach to the test is a common phrase. Well, when training, you really do need to teach to the test. Whatever the objectives are, you need to not meander too much, not go on too many rabbit trails, but teach and focus exactly on what people are going to be expected to learn. Present the information in a way that makes it easiest to understand for training. Identify different types of training content which may call for different training strategies. So this content is X. It could be best to represent this with an activity. Or it could be Y, which would be best represented with a flowchart graphic. Or so based on the content, how do you see that content being So what strategies are most effective or appropriate for teaching that sort of content? There are some things when it's just time, and you've probably realized this in your studies. It would been nice if Dr. Goodin had gotten out a dry erase board and just shown us the Venn diagram instead of trying to explain verbally how the diagram looks. Um, there's sometimes when sort of that visual aid will help, or that auditory cueing could help, or whatever it is, or a song about the material. It You're really open to being creative here as long as there is good logic. So I would suggest that you explain your logic of, here's the content, here's why I think it's good to present it in this fashion using this strategies, facts, concepts, processes, and procedures if applicable, modeling, any problem solving recommendations. So those are some of the options to give you some ideas. Like research papers, you should address the general topic and insights related to the topic, and then narrow it to the specific purpose of the presentation. So start with state of current knowledge and broad context, then funnel down to the issue at hand. What is the specific purpose of this presentation? So whatever you're going to talk about, give us some context, give us some background, and then tell us what we know, what is known currently about this, and then what you're going to add. And sometimes it's just pointing out to the audience members, well, based on all the professional developments you've had so far, this is 4 out of 5 professional developments, and so in the first 3, you should have learned this, and this, and you explain to them how that has led them to professional development 4, which is today, for instance, which you're going to teach them this thing that is logically coming next. Thoroughly address the problem. How, why, to whom, severity, cultural, and diversity worldviews of the problem. So what problem? I don't know if it's all-time high currently, but this has been a recent trend that is very concerning, and so this could be the problem, and it should be something that could easily be researched as well, and maybe you've done the research, and you're planning to do the research and present those results that we mentioned and conclusions, and it's that information that you're just now turning into, well, let me present this instead of in a dissertation form or in an article form. Let me present it as a training, to help people understand it, and maybe people that aren't scholars, maybe people that are more lay people, or maybe just to present it in more of an action training format, to where it's less of a research article that is a passive resource, and more of a, we're holding this training as a professional development or whatever, to make it clear to you that we want you to implement this. Whereas here's a research article doesn't always say do what they, it says that suicide's an issue. So research does not always emphasize sort of solutions and techniques and strategies. And generally, what you want to use with a training is to provide knowledge, but also some a toolkit, some resources, and solutions and strategies. Additionally, address systems involved. This could be church, college systems, obviously, communities, government. How does the problem affect others? Well, when there's a suicide, for instance, um, that does affect entire communities. It affects the schools. Schools not only suffer from having lost a student and all that offers, but in terms of keeping, let's say it's an HBCU, afloat, um, that can lead to lost revenue, lost support, especially if it becomes a problem on campus. That's not something you want to be known for. So whatever your problem is, just explain some of the intricacies of it. How does the problem affect others? How do other systems affect the issue? And this could be discrimination. Currently, we're in 2020, so it could be like you could bring up George Floyd um, murder, um, evidence-based practices, controversies. Well, some scholars maintain X, but others suggest Y. You'll want to get into that, implications of the research that you're sort of presenting. In other words, training is really presenting your research in a palatable way, so that people can understand and be activated to act upon this new knowledge and skill. What findings will they have, and as I've been sort of trying to emphasize, suggestions um, that they should have more trainings, more interventions, more strategies that they should use, and you'll identify those according to what you're presenting. Above, address these according to your problem. The following are points to consider as you present the content of your presentation. So you'll want to reflect on these things. I don't know where my down arrow is, but what information or content do you want participants to learn from the training or webinar? What specific detailed knowledge, information, or skills do you expect participants to learn from the training or webinar? So this is sort of going back to part one. What do you want them to do with that information? So you want to sort of connect the dots for them and say, we're teaching you this so that we can, and going back to the suicide example, identify and stop suicidality or suicidal ideation or stigmatization of suicide, whatever it is, you want to address that early on or something like that. So what is it you're trying to accomplish with the skills that you're training? What do you want them to do with this information? Take it home and put it under the mattress, or use it in the classroom, or it depends on who you're talking to. But obviously you want them to use it, so you might give them an example of here's how this could play out in the classroom or in the field, whatever field they may be in. What skills or competencies do you want them to gain, develop, expand, or improve? So you want to make sure that you've sort of highlighted this. I want you to be able to communicate with a student that is feeling depressed or having perceived burdensomeness or thwarted belongingness or acquired capability. Three of the things in a lot of suicide theory that are sort of critical factors. So you want to be able to identify those things and to communicate with students and to know your resources and to know the chain of command. Do you call the cops immediately? Do you go to the school psychologist? What is it that you do? And that's what you want to sort of train them and you want to sort of be explicit about everything you want them to actually know and really remember. Those are obviously the things you want to hit the hardest, and always come back to that at the end of the presentation. So if you haven't learned anything else, here's what you need to have learned. What materials need to be developed, so, and what will the materials include. So what do you need to do to get prepared for this? You're not going to present a training session from the hip, so to speak, spontaneously. So what do you need to develop? What resources might they need to take with them or to have in their hands during the training? What all do you need to build or develop in terms of making the training occur? What methods will be used so that participants meet the learning objectives and learn the content most effectively? What cross-cutting issues need to be included and which ones need to be prioritized? So you need to think about the context, any special issues, any diversity issues, anybody that might feel left out of the training, or in terms of the audience that they're serving, what might be some issues that you need to point out that they need to be aware of. Well, this is true for most individuals, but if you have an English as a second language individual, you might do something different there. So incorporate appropriate animations, transitions, and graphics, as well as speaker notes for each slide. One thing I'll say here is and I'm saying it this way because I want it to be clean. I want it to be creative, but not overly. So this isn't the time to be an artist, so to speak. Artisticness may be obvious in what you do, but you really want to make sure that you are focused. So, for instance, animations can really help focus the cognitive load of the trainee on the information that you want, or it can really distract. Remember the first days of the internet when there were all these things spinning around on every website that you went to, and the people that were creating the websites would put those just random globes spinning just because they had figured out how. So you need to figure out, okay, does this serve a purpose, or is this sort of pulling resources away from the cognitive load that I want focused on something more important? Your transitions, how are you going to go logically from one sort of phase of the training to the next? How are you going to make it all fit together and feel connected rather than disjointed? What graphics will be sort of memorable and not overwhelming? And you might have these as speaker notes for each slide. You might have needed to build these into materials. The speaker notes may be comprised of brief paragraphs or bulleted lists. Of course, the more bulleted lists you have, the longer it's going to be. So when it's slides, it doesn't really matter because a slide doesn't really have a length to it. The speaker notes may be comprised of brief paragraphs or bulleted lists. I'll let you decide how to do this if you really need to explain it. Otherwise, say, here are the topics, and you can present a bulleted list. Part 2 of the length, we're looking at 5 to 7 slides with a separate reference slide. So that really shows you how focused you need to be. You're going to have 6 to 8 slides total if you include the reference slide. That means if um, we don't really mention here. Title slide is probably useful, and that doesn't count towards the slide number either. But when you do start to present content, make sure that you gain attention as quickly as possible and then maintain it throughout. Notes length, so for those paragraphs or bullets, 65 to 150 words for each slide. References, you want to include a minimum of 3 scholarly resources just to show that, look, there's a little method to the madness. Here are some reasons that I've made the decisions I've made. The completed assignment should demonstrate, as with all our assignments, thoughtful consideration of the ideas and concepts presented in the course by providing new thoughts and insights related directly to this topic. The content should reflect scholarly writing and current APA standards and should adhere to the North Central University's academic integrity policy. And then, when applicable, conduct a Turnitin pre-check. It may be hard to do, so you may want to, if the Turnitin pre-check is turned on for this course for you, you might want to take your sort of PowerPoint or whatever slideshow content you have and put it in a Word document to have it checked for Turnitin. You don't want to have accidentally plagiarized. Although some self-plagiarism may be acceptable, you'll want to check with your instructor on that because you are sort of building information as you proceed, and you're encouraged to start working on the signature assignment ahead of time, and so it may show up more than once. But you definitely don't want to have matching content with a different author online or from another training or article. Then upload your completed assignment, click the Submit to Dropbox button. So it's sort of it seems like a heavy topic, and I think it does sort of pack a punch is sort of the word that the phrasing I think of when I think about this assignment. You need to put a lot of thought into it, and that's one of the last things here. It's sort of hard to measure, but if here, thoughtful consideration. So if you haven't presented evidence that you've really tied the training to meeting the objectives, then you may be missing the target for yourself. So you want to construct the training in a way that will directly, is built. We don't always hit the target, even though we try and we prepare that way. But you should have logic, rationale, even research support for the training decisions that you make to reach the obstacles that you've identified. Without objectives and goals and sort of questions, critical questions, you don't really have that target that you're asking your trainees to shoot for. And it allows your training to sort of be flimsy and vague and without organization. But by providing learning objectives, training outcomes, knowledge learning outcomes, questions to be answered, then you can use those as sort of the guiding principles to develop sort of each word, each sentence, each phrase, each slide, each graphic that you're going to present in this assignment. And so it should all be very thoughtful, and there should not be anything sort of like a dangling thread that just doesn't seem to fit. Your instructor should not be asking, well, why did you do that? You need to say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this because this. It will help my trainees be able to do this, to meet this learning objective. And so showing your thoughtfulness and conscientiousness and deliberate connection of the training decisions to the training outcomes really is what should be evident. So just filling up the slides, filling up the pages, that's not enough. Showing that thoughtful consideration of ideas and concepts and insights is really what we're looking for here. So it's sort of doing the work plus putting in the extra effort to say, I really thought about this. And without putting in the time to really prepare this assignment, you're not going to be well prepared for the signature assignment. If you put a lot of time in here, it will pay off for your signature assignment next week. Thank you very much. I look forward to talking with you about week 8.